maybe less. Some of the things I was going to discuss have been mentioned, and I see no necessity to repeat. I was asked to speak on the topic, the rapid growth of European Jewry from the late Middle Ages. And of course, the use of the term rapid is itself a subjective term. Rapid, perhaps in comparison to what we are familiar with in our current society, because I think that from the point of view of an early modern Jew or an early modern non-Jew, they would ask about our society. It's quite striking how the population of certain populations grows at a very slow rate, if it grows at all. So these are subjective terms, but rapid growth is the topic. Now, first off, I should note that rapid growth is nothing that is particularly unique or special about Jews. If we take a look at the Afrikaners in South Africa, which is a population of about 3 million, at least according to the sources I checked, they're descended from about 2,000 migrants who went from Holland to South Africa in the late 17th century. Out of 2,000 came, a few centuries later, 3 million. So the French speakers of Quebec are very similar. There, the population now is apparently about 6.5 million, and they're descended from about 5,000 migrants who came more or less at the same time. So there's no need to discuss demographic miracles. Miracles happen best in books, but not in reality. Populations can grow by what seems to us very quick rates in conditions which are conducive to childbirth, to low death rate, and to longevity. So the fact that apparently the Jewish population of Eastern Europe or earlier in Central Europe grew at a very fast rate is nothing which is terribly exceptional, and there's no need to come forward with all kinds of complicated explanations that there were unknown migrations, either of Khazars or massive conversions by Sorbians to Judaism, or lost unknown populations near the Black Sea that explain the Jewish population growth. Jews grew because conditions were good for population growth, and the job of historians is to try to understand why this could have happened. And here is where we are very much in need, as historians, in the help of geneticists, and I will try to give some homework at the end of my lecture. There's a certain feeling that when you teach for a while at the university, you can't end a talk without homework, but I will try to give some homework that perhaps will be picked up. Now, I'm going to focus on the Jews of Eastern Europe. Where did the Jews of Eastern Europe come from? Now, the simple explanation, and simplest explanations are good, is they came from the West. The question is, where in the West? Very often, there are very neat, elegant explanations which say the Jews were fleeing persecution and spread in the hope of finding a safe haven, thus going from the main important cities of Germany and the Rhineland to find a safe place in Poland. Now, the first thing that one should note, if even a quick look at a map would show that if you're going to flee from the Rhineland, the weather is much better and the food is much, much better in Italy, and that's a much more reasonable place to run away to. And indeed, there was one of the birthplace of Yiddish printing was in northern Italy. The Jews who came to Eastern Europe were apparently coming for much more prosaic reasons. They weren't fleeing persecution, but they were fleeing economic stress. one of the main factors in European population history in the Middle Ages was the Black Plague and the drama of the mass deaths for the Jews, the persecutions that quickly followed when Jews were perceived as responsible for all of this. This attracted a lot of attention. What has gotten less attention is that apparently the brown rat did not like speaking Slavic. And the mass Black Death that we saw or we read about in Central Europe had much less of an impact in the Czech lands, Bohemia, Moravia, much of what is now Austria. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't there at all, but it did not have the same impact that it had towards the West. The result was that when the Black Death was over, Europe, much of Western Europe was dramatically depopulated, and there were a lot of land available, there were many opportunities for the survivors, and the populations tended to stay put. Whereas in Bohemia, Moravia, which had not suffered massive population loss, there, as time went on, the local Jewish populations, which had grown faster than the non-Jewish populations, I'll get to that shortly, the Jewish populations found themselves dealing with overpopulation, competition for an economic niche, and for them, the solution was, in many individual cases, to go to the east. And they went to the east, not as a mass movement, not in parties of refugees, but one by one in small numbers, but the numbers accumulated, and those that came to the east found that there were opportunities in Poland. Poland at this time, and Lithuania, was undergoing a great period of economic growth. There was a great deal of export, big business, and the Jews were not part of this. The big businessmen were Germans, Dutch, Scots, who came from Scotland, Italians. They were the ones who controlled the export trade, the massive export of grain from Poland through the northern ports on the Baltic and then towards Western Europe. The Jews had to make do with the leftovers, some small trades, sometimes crafts. The Jews did not fill a major role in the Polish economy at the time, but for those Jews who made a living, they made a living. So we have here a movement of individuals. How can I say with some degree of confidence, that doesn't mean I'm always right, but I'm confident, that the population movement is not from the Rhineland, because the names that you find in Poland, especially of women, not the biblical names that men got, but the women's names were not the classic Rhineland names that women had, Brunlein, and names like that, but they were Czech names that reflect the recent migration from a nearby Czech lands. Now, one finds a major impact on the Yiddish that Jews spoke. The Yiddish that we find in Eastern Europe was based on the Yiddish of Western Europe, and there is no shortage of words that can be traced to Western Europe in Eastern European Yiddish. For example, there's a famous Sabbath dish that many Jews eat, called East European Jews eat, called Shaul. The word Shaul comes from the French word chaud, hot, or the word in Western Yiddish it's called shali. You have the word parve, the word which means that this is a food that it's not meat and it's not milk. It can be eaten with everything, which comes apparently from the Italian paus, or equal. So you have this in East European Yiddish. At the same time, Eastern European Yiddish is very different from the West. And here, how could this be if migrants are coming to the West? The answer here is simple. The Jewish migrants came in dribs and drabs from different places, mainly from the Czech lands, some from the southern lands, They were a small minority in Poland, and in Poland at that time, there was a very important and significant German population, and the spoken language reflects a mixture of the origins from many different areas, and what remained was an East European Yiddish. Now, where do the needs of historians or geneticists come in? One finds that the population of Eastern European Jewry, say in the year 1500, was 10,000, 20, 30,000, and that the population of East European Jewry around the year 1900 was much, much greater. We're talking about maybe population, including migrants, of 8 million, more than that, very large population. This, of course, can be a nice example for rapid population growth. But the truth is, there wasn't one rapid population growth, but a number of rapid population growths. And here we have to take a look once again at Yiddish. Within East European Yiddish, there are three basic dialects. There's a Lithuanian dialect, there's a Central Polish dialect, and a Southern or Ukrainian dialect. Why is this important? Dialects reflect an isolation of a population in which they deal mainly within a specific group, they marry within a specific group, there's migration is internal. This reflects a relative isolation. When you have large-scale migration, then populations mix, and then this erases many of the dialectical differences. So if we have three dialects, that reflects a dynamic in which there were three populations, and this fits very well what we know of the history of the time. The migrants came from the west, many of them on the main commercial route through Krakow. Some of the migrants moved up north, Lithuania, some to the south, to the east and to the south, Ukraine, and some remained in this central Polish area. Now, as I mentioned before, Poland was big business for German and Dutch and Italian and Scottish businessmen. However, after the spurt of Jewish migration from the east to Poland, business became bad, and the West European market no longer needed Polish grain. They were able to grow enough grain by themselves using new technology. The export market collapsed. The Germans went back. The Dutch went back. The Italians went back. The Armenians stayed. They didn't have much where to go back to. And the Scots moved back to Scotland. The Jews stayed because going back to the Czech lands was not, or to Austria, was not going to give them many economic opportunities. And luckily for this Jewish population, more or less at the same time, the Polish nobility, realizing that the export market for grain had declined, began to put more and more efforts into distilling grain and selling it on the local market. And this created a basic economic niche which Jews could fill, working in the liquor business and mainly in the selling of the liquor on a local level. So that there were a lot of local jobs available, new economic niche, and this is what made it unnecessary to continue distance migration, and the regions which already had a kernel or a nucleus of Jewish population continued to develop with migration now from city to town and to village. This was helped by the occasional expulsion of Jews from major cities, and the local populations grew within the region. Now, some of the anti-Semitism was a very mixed blessing. It wasn't all a curse. Jews were expelled from cities, and as people know who deal with medieval cities were characterized by negative population growth. The cities swallowed up populations, but they didn't produce a new generation because the death rate in cities was very high, largely because of polluted water supplies. The Jews who were expelled from cities cried bitterly about having to leave a glorious city, but finding themselves in towns and villages, they found themselves in an ecological environment which helped the already very healthy birth rate, not the birth rate, but helped keep under control the death rate. The key to the population growth was a low death rate of children among Jews, much lower than among their non-Jewish neighbors. So that one has then three populations, each of which grow rapidly, where they're not growing by interregional migration, that we know by the Yiddish. They're growing by internal natural dynamics. Now, this is verified in other directions. There are genetic diseases which are typical of specific areas, either Lithuania or Central Poland or Ukraine. There are a lot of other phenomena which are also very regional, and the examination of the genetics of Jews, especially checking for genetic drift and bottlenecks, here could be extremely illuminating. Now I'm coming to the homework. Much of the work, now I should say one thing. I try to keep up on the literature, and if I've made a mistake, I will be very happy. If somebody's done what I was hoping would be done, I'll be very happy to know about it, but I haven't found it yet. Most of the work that is done now has tended to look at Ashkenazi. This is a classification of Jews. And here we're dealing with a population which is really made up of elements which have a great deal in common, but are also distinctive. The Jewish population of Eastern Europe, as far as I understand it, split off from the Jewish population of Western Europe relatively early on in the Middle Ages. The Jews of Eastern Europe descended, I think, from Czech Jews, and they had already moved to the Czech lands from the Rhineland in the mid-medieval period, if not earlier. So that we have here separate population groups. What would be really useful would be if somebody would take a Western European Ashkenazi population and see how different is their genetic makeup from East European Ashkenazi. Till now, people say Ashkenazi, they really mean East European. And this could be done very easily. In Strasbourg, in France, there is a large community of West European Ashkenazim who have lived there in generations without any admixtures of East European migrants. The East Europeans moved to Germany in the 19th century in masses. So whatever you find from Berlin or Frankfurt or Hamburg is problematic. But Strasbourg is old root West Ashkenazi population. All you have to do is to go to a wedding in Strasbourg and collect 50 or 100 swabs, and there's a paper. And this will be very, very interesting to compare with the East European Ashkenazi. How different are they? The same could be done, although this is a little more complicated, with descendants of Jews from Bavarian villages, where also there were no migrants from Eastern Europe to confuse the genetic picture. And there are all these clubs of Jews from Fürth and all kinds of small towns in Bavaria that could be relatively easily analyzed. Maybe on Washington Heights in New York, some evening, a lecture on the history of German Jews, the population is there. Then, in dealing with East European Jews, similar tests could be made with Lithuanian Jews.
You have 2 minutes more. 2 minutes more. You'll be on 20 minutes.
Okay. The Lithuanian Jews with Ukrainian Jews, skip Odessa, which took in everybody, but take small Ukrainian towns and small Polish towns. At least when dealing with genetic diseases, it would be really nice for people like me if instead of asking, are you Ashkenazi, but to ask, what region did the parents come from? And an attempt to be specific in terms of Lithuania, Central Poland, Ukrainian, might very well bear a lot of fruit with a relatively limited investment. So there's a lot that can be done. I can say without a question that this kind of an analysis specifically about bottlenecks, about dates of separation, was the separation from 1400 or 1700? For a historian, that could be very, very useful, and I suspect it would also be useful for you.
Thank you very much.